first and foremost can be welcome for brothers who have joined us and for making the effort. Oh, one thing I can say, you'll not be disappointed that you've made the trip. Because this book, Racism Handbook, is a handbook. Those of us who realize that we have some serious issues of race to deal with, and we need a tool, we need a kind of information that will allow us to peer through the fog and to get a better grasp of what it is that we face, its impact, and what we need to do to make some fundamental repairs to the attacks that people get. So brothers put together this book, and he's here to give us some insight as to what it is that we need to equip ourselves with. In fact, if you have a motor car, you'd have a handbook. After it's far developed, you can say, oh, there's a noise, bang, 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 bang. You look it up, whoa, that's what causes it. I need to fix. That's just the mechanical deep. What say when you're under a vicious, psychological, brutal attack from enemies everywhere, whether they're Haitian or the Chinese, India, all tribes of Europeans, and the Arabs, all bouncing at you at the same time, working together. And your own people who through ignorance, greed, stupidity, whatever, allowing the process to go on. So we're very happy that God Howard has taken the time to come and share with us what's inside his hand. I hope that when we leave, we'll have one in our hands that will assist us with that understanding. We can also recommend to others that they too need to get a copy of it. That's what you to be out.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks. It's good to hear you talk, Aldo. We're really good. So, I remember coming here in, I think it was 2007, and I said to Elder Pepper Quiet, could have been 9, I said, I'm thinking of writing a book. And you were sitting on that desk over there. And that's when the hall was out through there. I don't know if you've seen it. And you said, yes, great. And you can come and give the lecture. So it's here. So that's wonderful. So today I'm going to, the title of the presentation is called, you just get my glasses on here. Achieving black consciousness through our collective knowledge. Achieving black consciousness through our collective knowledge. But before I get into that title and break that down, I'm going to read you a little excerpt from the book so you can just get a flavour of the book, and then I'll weave the lecture in to the book as well. But let's just read an introduction, a little bit of the introduction from the handbook. Right, this is from the introduction there, yeah? The introduction, the reality of racism. If you do not understand racism correctly, you do not understand yourself. The black self is constructed in the Eurocentric world in which you were born. This handbook will show that in this Western world, you were born into a global interconnected system of racism, white domination, or white supremacy. This is so whether you live in the UK, US, France, Germany, Africa, the Caribbean, or anywhere else on earth. Moreover, it means that you were categorized at birth as a sub-person. Furthermore, it means that your psyche has been subjected to unrelenting psychopolitical violence from a very early age. Fundamentally, this violence has disconnected you from your history and your black self. Thus, the purpose of this handbook is to help black people grasp the full meaning of this system so as to understand the social, political, economic, cultural, psychological nature of their existence as African people classified as black. This handbook will change your life. It will do so by providing you with a knowledge of the black self, by means of an accurate understanding of race and racism. This process is essentially the acquisition of knowledge by which one reconnects with one's history. Black people during slavery, colonialism and settlerism were decultured. Since the end of slavery, they've been in a process of reculturation into European culture, and that applies globally. So it doesn't matter if you're continental Africa, you're still part of the reculturation into global white domination. Ultimately, the finding of the black self is necessary to destroy the haunting contradictions of racism, which run the risk of becoming insurmountable. The black self is therefore ready for survival in the post-colonial context. As Fanon states, if it is not accomplished, there will be serious psychoaffective injuries, and the result will be individuals without an anchor, without an horizon, colourless, stateless, rootless, a race of angels. The title of this book, The Racism Handbook for People Classified as Black, is somewhat provocative, as it's intended to focus solely on educating ordinary people who are classified as black. It will explain race and racism, its history, legacy, reproduction, and the contemporary ideologies that surround it. Classified as black means that we've been racialized or categorized as black people. This is an empirical fact which will be explained. The handbook will explain the ways in which the word black, as Dr. Henry Clark explained, is limited, since we are in fact essentially African people, or people of African descent, dominated through the process of elite European racialization. Racism is not what you think it is. In other words, racism is a profound phenomenon analogous to a conspiracy theory against people classified as black. By contrast, the way in which it actually functions requires an awareness beyond the superficial, along critical lines of thinking, to see it as it actually is. Also a willingness to accept the reality of racism. Many black people, also mixed black and white race people, are unwilling to accept the reality of racism. Thus, they unfortunately have limited knowledge about the historical, political and social dynamics of race and racism. The handbook categorically states a black person will not be able to properly understand racism unless the origins of race and racism are historicized. This means that a person must understand the historical development of race and racism in order to understand the reproduction of racism in the contemporary world. A person classified as black will not understand race and racism properly by learning diversity and inclusion policies and training at work, or reading random online definitions, or watching various YouTube clips. Furthermore, they will not understand by reading governmental equality, diversity and race relations documents. The handbook states candidly that because of the way many whites feel about racism, their books often fail to give a black person clarity about race and racism, with a clear, cohesive continuity that links them to the global black contemporary experience. This handbook is written from the perspective that race, racism, racial inequality, racial discrimination, and racial prejudice and white supremacy are all byproducts of Western society and European expansionism. In this context, for people classified as black, speaking about race and racism in the UK is practically taboo. This means that most black people today avoid talking about racism with people classified as white unless they adopt the tone that is acceptable to whites. This tone means that essentially blacks cannot speak honestly about race and racism to most whites. Blacks must literally lie about the reality of racism in the company of whites in order to feel accepted by them or not to offend. This situation ultimately has damaging effects on your psychology because it is a form of racial enslavement whereby blacks must speak a certain way about race and racism around whites. It is also a political strategy used and created by many whites as an instrument of control. Certain whites are manipulating your consciousness by controlling how you think and speak about race and racism, ultimately distorting your understanding of how racism really works. All right, so that's just a little bit of a taster of the book, the style in which it's written. So to promote the book today, I've got this little presentation that you've seen with the leaflet that's called Achieving Black Consciousness Through Our Collective Knowledge. There's two phrases in that title that we need to unpick: black consciousness and collective knowledge. So let's talk a little bit about black consciousness, because Elder spoke about it in many respects. When we talk about black consciousness, that is a commitment to blackness. Doesn't matter if you're Nigerian, Ghanaian, St. Lucian, Jamaican, Trinidadian. It's a commitment to blackness that we have globally, given that we have had over 500 years of oppression as a so-called race of people. Globally, with a commitment to that I don't want you oppressed and you don't want me oppressed. We may have slightly different ethnic groups within our blackness, but it's a global commitment to the notion of blackness in struggle and as resistance against white supremacy. One of the ways of understanding black consciousness, just think of white consciousness. Think of the landmass of Europe, for example. You have France, Germany, Belgium and so on. They call themselves white people. They accept their distinctions culturally, but they still have whiteness, a collective consciousness that binds them together in times of need or degradation or colonialism. Whatever they want to do, they come together in times of need. They have this whiteness, this collective consciousness, and that's a way that we can understand blackness. So it's not so much our diverse ethnicities, but more a collective responsibility to black people. And I would say, and I've said it multiple times in other lectures, that black consciousness is our problem. That's our problem. If you wanted to summarize it, the lack of black consciousness. If we had black consciousness, there would have been no slavery, no colonialism, no neo-colonialism, no structural programs given to you by the West on the African continent. The capitalist world economy wouldn't be doing what it did 500 years ago on the African continent with its structural programs, constantly extracting wealth from Africa. Because all those Africans on the continent would have this oneness of thought over and above ideological and religious lines. It would be blackness. Okay, you're Muslim, or I'm not a Muslim, or whatever, but we'd have this oneness on the continent and the Caribbean, a collective blackness. So that's why we're in the state we're in, because we don't have a proper sense of blackness, a proper sense of commitment to what it means to be black. So that's the first part of the term. The second part of that is gaining this black consciousness through our collective knowledge. Collective knowledge. There's a word related to collective knowledge which is called epistemology. All words come from us anyway, because we wrote the first script of language and so on. So we have this word epistemology. And all it means is knowledge production. Where does knowledge come from? Where did we get it from? Who structured that knowledge? Is it ours? Is it true? What's the source of that knowledge? So our collective knowledge, a good example is this room. If you look around you, these are practically everyone is a black author. So this room would represent much of our collective knowledge, okay, over and above ideological lines. So, for example, that book on Malcolm X there was written by a black conservative. I'm not a black conservative, okay, but I read that book. There was still something that I could get from it. You see? So our collective knowledge is our own understanding of who we are and where we are going. Okay? So we want to achieve black consciousness through collective knowledge. And that collective knowledge is our own knowledge. What's that got to do with this book? Well, this book is called the Racism Handbook for people classified as black. And I think the main thing that I want to say is, why is it called racism? Why is it not called Introduction to Black Studies? Because that's what this is. It's really an introduction to black studies. But the first thing to understand really is that the origins of black study has its roots in our collective knowledge. And that's why I wrote this, because as Elder said earlier, we often seem to be people that were very reactionary. We know we want to survive. You come here. We were here through forced migration. You've come over recently. What are we here? What are we doing? We're just surviving as black people? What's going on? What are we going to do? Are we going to find a way out of this white domination? Well, black studies can help us to do that. Black studies can help us gain ground with our collective knowledge. When did it begin? Black studies began in the United States, all right, in response to the struggles that come directly out of slavery and colonialism. Black studies began with the African Americans. When they came out of slavery, the system started to develop what they called historically black colleges. And they just wanted to silo black people off and give them inferior education. But black people were not going to have that. They wanted to take control of the curriculum. And they did take control of the curriculum. It wasn't easy. It was through conflict among themselves, conflicts with the social order. They did it through sit-ins. This is after the civil rights movement. Sit-ins, rallies, freedom rides, protests and so on. And they took control of the curriculum and started to write about themselves. They said, no, we want to centre the study on us as a tool of anti-racism. And they began to set up different disciplines at the universities. So the white structure set up the universities and the blacks took control of the curriculum. Many died, lots of conflict, but we did it. They did it in the United States. What were the disciplines? The disciplines were race, class, gender, colonialism, anthropology, sociology, psychology, literature, science, religion, spirituality, and economics were some of the disciplines that comprised black studies. Now, from those disciplines, and remember there were many colleges around the United States. You've got to remember, we've come out of slavery. The blacks have come out of slavery. They wanted to sequester them off and just put them in the college and give them inferior. No, we took control of the curriculum. And that black studies, that's why you're seeing all these books around you now.
Yeah.
They got all those various disciplines that I mentioned, and they put it into what we can call a conceptual framework, or an inclusive conceptual framework.
So
let's have a look at...
not interrupt you, brother.
Sure.
The black studies, it created the explosion of these publications, right?
Absolutely. Well done. Yeah, absolutely. So, those various disciplines were put into what we call an inclusive conceptual framework, or a framework for all those different disciplines. Now let's go through them, because it's really important to understand this. 5 aspects of this framework, and we'll see how it relates to our very existence in a minute. Number 1, the first thing to understand was that the studies centered black people. Black people, it was about African Americans, and then it was about the diaspora, and then it was about Africans on the continent. It was about black people all over the world. That was the subject. It wasn't going to be about Greek mythology. It was going to be about black people themselves, whether they were going to be in America or the diaspora or on the continent. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect was that black people would be the agents of that. We would study ourselves, whether it would be in America, whether it would be in France, Germany, Oceania, wherever we found ourselves, we would be the centre of that study. Now, the third thing, which is really important, is that black studies is essentially an anti-racist activity. Enter the Racism Handbook. Now, one famous, well, not that famous, but one brother in our community wondered why I called it the Racism Handbook. Why not call it Introduction to Black Studies? Well, for that third reason. Black studies is inherently an anti-racist activity. And because I call it the Racism Handbook, people can relate to that. If I call that Introduction to Black Studies, some black people think, okay, well, it's to do with the United States, it's to do with a particular curriculum. And yet that word covers colonialism, slavery, settlerism, racism. Everything is covered. Well, not obviously racism. Everything is covered by that word. It's like a metonym. Okay? So that's the third thing. The fourth thing, really, that black studies is a celebration of our culture. Globally, we celebrate our culture. We can celebrate the medieval black culture. We've got a massive... Look at that book we've got right there. You know, the Benin monarchy. We can celebrate our ancient cultures. But more importantly, because we are 21st century Africans, we can celebrate our modern culture, who we are as Africans, what it means to go to different parts of Africa, to see black people in different parts of the world, in Brazil, in Suriname, and everywhere we go. It's a celebration of ourselves. And through that celebration, it's a doorway into actually understanding humanity. What it means to be human is expressed in studying ourselves. Just like Europeans study themselves, it gives them a sense of what they are. We study black studies, so it gives us a sense or a doorway into what it means to be human. And then 5, which is really important, black studies is an analysis of the capitalist world system as it relates to colonialism, slavery, and neo-colonialism. So right now, the capitalist world order is still doing what it did 500 years ago, particularly on the African continent, with wealth extraction. And the West introduces its various structural programs. We see for the World Bank and the IMF and so on. These are arms of white supremacy, and black studies covers that. So why am I panning it out? Why am I making this big thing about black studies? It's because when you know yourself, you know your history, you know where you come from, then you're more apt to survive rather than being reactionary. Now, do we have black studies in the UK? Yes. Never in London, and that's a political thing. No black studies in London. We have black studies at the University of Birmingham City University there. But beyond that, a lot of black people don't actually, they see it as an academic thing. They don't really go there. All right? Lots of people, oh, that's something, that's a kind of specialist subject. It's not specialist, because I've just shown that black studies came out of struggle and resistance. Straight after the civil rights, just put them in those colleges and give them some. No, we're going to study ourselves. Through the process of study, we survive. It's not just head knowledge. It's not just being smart and be able to be articulate. It's about using black studies as a method for study. Now, I'm a school teacher, and I can tell you that our children are what I call racially illiterate. And I can speak to children up to year 13, okay? Racially illiterate. Literally, they know nothing. And you might say, well, okay, they know they're black, they know a little bit about their culture. What's the big deal? The big deal is they don't see the dangers that we're in. They don't have a sense of proportion of who we are and where we are. Black studies centres that. It gives you a sense of proportion, because black studies came out of the very notion of oppression itself. We decided to study ourselves as a method of survival. It shows that we're rational thinking people. You're outnumbered in a war, you still find ways of surviving. Okay, you're going to put me in those horrible colleges. Okay, well, I'm going to write the curriculum. Now, the reason we're oppressed today is because the systems of oppression are still in place. But we're not centering ourselves on our black studies. And remember, black studies include, notice it's not just called African studies or Caribbean studies, it's called black studies, you see? So it encompasses all of the black condition. It doesn't matter if it's on the continent or the Caribbean or even Australia, it doesn't matter. We're going to look globally at where we are and how we can improve our life's condition. So,
if he says African studies, it would center on in Africa. But when
black studies would center on Africa. In fact, in the United States, another term for it is called Africana studies. So, no, it would center on Africa. Africa would be part of it. You can do a course where you, at SOAS, and study just Africa. Of course, you can do that. But black studies would cover Africa, and the center would always be the degree to which we are oppressed. Remember, it's an anti-racist activity, you see. But if you go to a course and just study colonialism, you'll study about, how Europe went to Africa, European expansionism and so on, but not necessarily get the ties to the now, the world capitalist order, the fact that it's still extracting wealth from Africa, you see. So that's what black studies is about, and that's what I've tried to do. So it's over 3 volumes. This is volume 1. Volume 2 is already written, but just need to do a few things. But this came out last year, Black History Month, so it's only 3 months old. So there's volume 2 to come out, and then there's the volume 3, which is the Racism Handbook for young people. And for that one, I've decided it to be, because this is like for black people, I've decided for 3 to include whites, blacks and Asians, because when we're young, we interact, certainly from the UK perspective, we interact with the different races. So I want our children to understand what the Asian experience is, what the white experience is. You see, a lot of our children don't understand what racism is in relation to Asians, or what racism is in relation to white. And you can get mixed up. Diane Ann got a few things mixed up, and she got herself in some trouble, you know what I mean, because she implied that whites there's no racism in white history. There is, okay, but not systemic racism. But there was. So our young children need to understand that.
Is the volume 3 specific for children?
For children, absolutely, yeah. From the ages of 10 up until about, I would say, their teens, yeah? Yeah, so it's just for young people. So they understand race, racism, colonialism, and the black colonial condition. Okay, so that is basically it. I don't want to bombard you with too much. Please feel free to ask me any questions what you want. Go ahead. That's the lecture.